that is the reason why I am introducing very shortly our friend Roland Freudenstein. You know his CV because he's the most important facts of his life, so to say, is in the invitation paper. But let me say that as an old friend of Roland, because we are working together in the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels, I know his professionalism, his accuracy, his knowledge on a very special, how to say, field, the political analysis of the recent developments inside of the European community and outside of our, how to say, our world. And therefore I think that we have a perfectly qualified person to hear the original and important remarks on the topic, I mean on the liberal democracy. Roland, and I think that is not in this short bibliographical note in our invitation paper, Roland is directing one of the most outstanding think tanks, political think tanks in the world. The Martens Center is considered among the best think tanks, political think tanks. And as a witness of their work, I have to say that this is something very important in the study of political, social, demographic developments in Europe. The European People's Party, which is using this expertise of the Wilfried Martens Center, practically has an enormous chance that this team, this research work, which is directed since the beginning by Roland, is at his disposal, because I think that from that point of view, really we have one of the most important centers of analysis and of facts, figures, and developments, very rapid reactions on different developments on the European scene. So I suggest to study and to see the website of this center, because it reflects a very high quality work on these topics, and also it is a perfect illustration of what Roland is doing for that center. So I am very proud and happy to have Roland this evening with us, and I hope that he will give us a lot of important information and analyses on the topic. And also I invite the audience to make the necessary remarks and put questions to him. So thank you, Roland, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Come.
Well, thank you, George, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited here by Nézőpont and also by the Danube Institute. It's my first time to be invited by these two organizations, but it's not my first time in Budapest. In fact, I was telling Kalman in the taxi that this is the place, and you won't find this in my CV, this is the place where I played my first computer game in my life. In 1979, our school decided to do the class trip before the final high school exams. to Budapest. And although this kind of trips usually ends up in more of a group dynamic experience, we were exposed to the real world here in two ways. Once, of course, in an organized meeting in what I think was probably a party youth organization club, and they had a computer game named Pong, where you played kind of table tennis on a screen. And for me, this was the epitome of modernity, which was the desired effect, of course. But the most interesting meeting with youngsters took place outside of that organized space, as you can imagine. Anyway, I was impressed by Hungary then, I'm impressed by Hungary now. And, you know, if I was British or American, I would have to tell you some kind of joke or anecdote. Now, thank God I'm German. So I'll make as we call it, a Vorbemerkung, introductory remark, actually two of them. First one is that whatever I'm saying here is my personal opinion and does not reflect in any way the European People's Party. And the second is that, well, the second is actually a movie scene from another relic of the 1970s, Peter Sellers as Chief Inspector Clouseau in The Pink Panther Strikes Back. Anyway, the scene is that he's a detective, he comes to a Bavarian small hotel, and he approaches the reception, and in his very, very funny French accent, he sees, well, first of all, he sees a little dog hopping around the reception area, and he asks the receptionist, "Does your dog bite?" And the receptionist is a bit unfriendly, very German, so he says, "No." So Peter Sellers bends down, tries to pat the dog on the back, and of course, inevitably gets bitten by the dog. So he furiously turns around at the receptionist and said, "You liar, you said your dog did not bite." And the receptionist says, "This is not my dog." Which all goes to say that sometimes it's not important to have the right answer, but it's important to ask the right question. So my question for tonight is not, does liberal democracy have a future? Because the answer is a resounding yes. The question is, what can we do to strengthen it? And are we part of the problem or part of the solution? So liberal democracy is our Schlagerthema, a new Hungarian word that I just learned from watching speeches on YouTube. So let me now, let's see how this works. Great, okay. Let me introduce you to three gentlemen who have criticized liberal democracy recently. This is Slavoj Žižek from Slovenia, and he's Europe's leading neo-Marxist philosopher. He's arguably the best-known Slovene intellectual internationally today, much to the chagrin of our Slovene center-right friends, but that's a fact. And he's not only an intellectual, but also a very funny writer, by the way, very entertaining, which is why we have to take him seriously. The next one is Alexander Dugin, an extreme Russian nationalist. I think a few years ago, many in the West, as well as in Russia itself, would have qualified him as a crackpot, as a crazy guy, who mixes neo-communist ideas with great Russian revisionism and, frankly, fascist and even occultist tendencies. So, I mean, there would be no reason to show him here if he hadn't become, in recent years, very influential with the Kremlin and actually the father of the revival of Novorossiya and Eurasianism. By the way, these beards are amazing, aren't they? I understand that metrosexual is out and timbersexual is in other words, real macho beards. But if this continues, then ISIS will have a really easy job to bring their foreign fighters into our societies. And finally, a beardless guy, and probably the most interesting of these three, Eric X. Lee, a Chinese political scientist and a very successful entrepreneur, whose TEDx speech, you know, TEDx is a short but intense speech format. So his TEDx speech, A Tale of Two Political Systems, is arguably one of the most popular and serious critiques of the West made in recent years. And it's a very impressive performance. But before we get to each of these men, let me sketch out a few definitions. What do I understand by liberal democracy? First of all, it's a form of government. It's not an ideology, and it's certainly not a policy. It is a form of government in which representative democracy operates under the principles of liberalism, that is, protecting the rights of the individual, which are generally enshrined in law, and it's characterized by fair, free, and competitive elections between multiple distinct political parties, a separation of powers into different branches of government, the rule of law in everyday life as part of an open society, and the equal protection of human rights, civil liberties, and political freedoms for all persons. So, after a period, and I'm quoting from Wikipedia here, after a period of sustained expansion throughout the 20th century, liberal democracy became the predominant political system in the world. Well, some people would argue that, of course, but that's what we're here to discuss. Now, as to illiberal democracy, the term was coined by someone else, but it was made popular and introduced into the wider discourse by an American journalist, publisher named Fareed Zakaria, who wrote an article in 1997 in Foreign Affairs where he introduced this, and the definition is regimes that mix elections and authoritarianism. And Fareed Zakaria argues that they are the result of countries that try to democratize without having a sturdy structure around the free market and sound political institutions with checks and balances. So here's what I'm aiming at. You know, the difference between the two is basically separation of powers and checks and balances. In illiberal democracy is not there. Liberal democracy is liberal because of that. So let's go back to our three gentlemen that I would like to talk about. Zizek has qualified liberal democracy as an anemic political ideology which dabbles in rhetorical constructs such as freedom and human rights, all of which serve to mask the control that the system has achieved over its apologists, resulting in their deeper unfreedom. You can already see that he's strongly influenced by psychology. He's using psychological language also in this quote about him. Zizek proposes that we instead summon the courage to reject liberal democracy as a master signifier and a main political fetish and explore other political options, by which he means some kind of neo-Marxist socialist vision. Fetish, main master signifier, that's language from psychology, of course. And he's actually, he started out in popularizing a French neo-Freudian psychologist, Jacques Lacan, and Zizek is today arguably a figurehead of the anti-capitalist, anti-globalist radical left in Europe and America. And in a BBC interview a few years ago, he basically said that the belief in global democracy was shattered in 2001 with the attacks on Washington and the World Trade Center in 9/11, and that global capitalism received its death blow in the economic and financial crisis since 2008. So what's our answer? What's my answer? I don't know what yours is, but my answer is that tackling the economy, indeed, liberal democracy has to shape up, has to get its act together, and that refers especially to the European Union. And I think there are obviously 5 points which have to be tackled in the near future. also both on the EU level and on the national level, better regulation, cutting red tape, reforms of the labor market, completing the single market of the European Union, and promoting transatlantic trade. Also to make up for the trade that we're losing now through the massive economic disengagement from Russia. So I think by shaping up economically, we can already prove him wrong. But politically, I think we have to become much more aware of our strengths as liberal democracies. The attraction that this system obviously exerts on demonstrators from the Euromaidan in Kiev, to the Gezi Park protesters in Turkey, to Occupy Central in Hong Kong, and across many, many other countries in the world, where a rising middle class is demanding more rule of law, a better control of those in power, and of course also multi-party elections, but that's not all they're demanding. So global democracy support for these people and for democrats around the globe remains one of the cornerstones of Western liberal democracy. Despite the difficulties and the setbacks, which could be called democratic backsliding, cultural determinism is the wrong approach. You know, to say that, for example, Arabs can't do democracy, or Chinese are unsuitable, or there's a Chinese culture which makes it impossible to organize liberal democracy in that country. No, there are enough proofs, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other Confucian-based societies that prove the contrary. So next, Alexander Dugin. This is a very brutal quote, I reckon. But if you are in favor of global liberal hegemony, you are the enemy. Well, Dugin is a brutal man, we have to admit it. And he comes from National Bolshevism, as I said, once even proudly declared himself a fascist. And he actually, and this is interesting, imported many of his concepts from Western Europe, notably from the French Nouvelle Droite, the New Right, of the 1960s and 1970s. Alain de Benoist is one of those gurus of the French New Right who actually were at the root of Dugin's thinking. So for Dugin, the decadence, the ethnic mix, and the abandonment of the nation-state in Western society weakens it to the point where, as he said, it should be conquered by Russia and made subservient to Russia. And that would be good for these European countries. The amazing thing is, with absurd theses like this, nevertheless, within 10 years, he went from being a total outsider of Russian political discourse to becoming a Kremlin whisperer, a man whose opinions are strongly informing Putin's strategies in today's situation. And as I said, ideas like Eurasianism, the rediscovery of Novorossiya, which is originally a term from the 19th century. I mean, all these central terms in Vladimir Putin's new ideology are actually are based on Alexander Dugin's writings and speeches. Well, as an answer, I think I can make it very short. I would say that these theories are obviously and completely incompatible with our definition of human rights and individual freedom, and therefore unacceptable. But what's more importantly, Dugin makes the same mistake as Zizek, as different as they are. He underestimates the West's ability to bounce back when you least expect it. You remember the 1930s? No, you don't. I don't either. But you know what the 1930s were. Liberal democracy in the West seemed in retreat. They looked very, very unhealthy compared to the new authoritarian regimes that were fashionable at the time. And yet, when really seriously challenged, the West came back, and came back with a vengeance. And there were other times in history when the West didn't look so good, and I think we're in one of these times again. We look old to the rest of the world. It's very easy to say that other other systems are more performing economically. There's some people who would even say, Zizek, for example, says, look at China, they're beating the West at its own game. They're the better capitalists. Give it some more time. Maybe it was our illusion of 1989 that things would move so quickly, but we're coming to the end of history at the end of my presentation. But let me just continue with the third gentleman here, who I would say is probably the most interesting of the three. So Eric Exley starts his TEDx, and really I urge you to watch it. If you never watch YouTube, watch this one clip, the TEDx clip of Eric Exley. It's really impressive. It's so good, it's scary. But there are answers to his rhetoric. Now, he starts out by showing a picture of Shanghai today and says, this is the place where I was born. And then he says, of course, this is not where I was born. I was born here. And then he shows Shanghai from the 1960s in a black and white, where people are in more or less uniformed clothing and very, very poor. And he says, look, I learned in those days that communism was the one end to which humankind will develop inevitably, should develop. Communism was the thing. And now, since 1989, Western liberal democracy is telling the rest of the world the same thing. Well, fooled me once, you won't fool me twice. So he actually says, he compares the Fukuyama narrative about the end of history and liberal democracy being the best of all systems to the communist narrative of the only right and just society. We'll come back to this in a minute. He also makes quotes like, Winston Churchill once said that democracy is a terrible system except for all the rest. Well, he never heard of the organizational department of the Communist Party of China. So what he does in his TEDx speech is basically, he makes the case for one-party rule. He says that for China and maybe for the rest of the world, one-party rule is actually better. It has more adaptability, more legitimacy, and a better meritocracy than any Western system. I would answer to this in four steps. First of all, for example, on the legitimacy question, he quotes what he sees as fact that the Chinese Communist Party, and especially the organizational department of the Chinese Communist Party, bases most of its decisions on opinion polls. And therefore, this is a much more reliable form of democracy than these stupid elections. Well, opinion polls in a totalitarian society are problematic. They are certainly not the same thing as opinion polls in a free society. He also claims that Transparency International is now ranking China at such and such a place compared to other countries. And that corruption, that the corruption does exist in China, but the Communist Party is about to defeat it. It's amazing that an organization that calls itself Transparency International bases its estimates on data from a society where the power structure does everything to remain opaque. Same argument as in the point one. How can you trust whatever is available in data about corruption in China if it's not an open society? Maybe even more interesting is this culturalist argument, Asian values or Chinese values, that democracy may be right for other countries but not for China. Well, how about Hong Kong? How about Taiwan? But also, how about Japan and South Korea, being other cultures that are deeply Confucianist in their cultural outlook, and yet can very well live with Western-based democracy? I think they're living proof that the narrative about the incompatibility of Chinese culture and Western democracy is not true. Finally, and this is the most interesting point of his speech probably, his refutation of Western universalism, where he compares the communist narrative of his childhood to the Fukuyama 1989 narrative about the ultimate victory of liberal democracy across the world, of democratic capitalism, of the combination of political and economic freedom and its mutual interdependence. Well, very simply said, he confuses a normative statement with a factual one. You know, it's a difference whether I say a house will be built here or a house should be built here. The imagination of a communist final society was always something that was to happen in the future. Whatever shade of communism you talk about, there was never the claim that we have it here and now, and there certainly wasn't any time to look back upon when it functioned, but it was always something in the future. Well, liberal democracy happens to be exactly the contrary. The narrative that liberal democracy, you know, again, coming back to Churchill, may be the worst of all systems except for all the others, was based on a couple of centuries of empirical evidence. And yes, we were rash, we were premature in 1989 to already declare victory. And the challenges that we have encountered in the 25 years hence were much bigger than we could ever imagine in those crazy days of the autumn of '89 and the year of 1990 and 1991. Western universalism has taken some hits, but it's not a wrong thing. If anything of 1989 has a meaning for the 21st century, it is in the validity of the West, not as a system of Western values, but as the place where universal values were first discovered and were first put into political practice. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is something that every country in the world has to accept being measured against. And, you know, as Mikhail Saakashvili said in his parting speech to the United Nations General Assembly last year, history may not have ended in 1989, but freedom remains its motor and its horizon. Thank you very much.
I'll begin again. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Freudenstein, distinguished guests. Well, first of all, I want to begin by thanking Roland Freudenstein for a fascinating and powerful argument that is fundamental to our political debates at the moment, many-sided and at the same time highly topical. Both the Danube Institute and our partners in the Nezapont Foundation are fortunate to have had this event, and I think everybody here has had their ideas clarified and their judgment of these matters strengthened. Now, it's fairly easy for me to say these pleasant things because I agree more or less, I'm in substantial and deep agreement with Mr. Freudenstein. I do have some points of disagreement, which I'll come to, but on the main points of his argument, I am in full agreement. And I suppose I might feel differently if I were Alexander Dugin or Slavoj Žižek or even Vladimir Putin. But it seems to me both historically true and philosophically important to say, as he does in his talk, three things. First of all, he gives a decisive role in the ending of Soviet power and the East-West division of Europe to people here, the peoples of Eastern and Central Europe. The world changed in 1989 and later, and these gains for the better were not a gift from Mr. Gorbachev. He was in effect more a cause than an effect in the events of the 1980s. Gorbachev was a necessary response by the Soviet Union to the revival of the West under Reagan, Thatcher, Kohl, and under the religious inspiration of John Paul II. The historical role that was made by him is small compared to those Western leaders, and it's small too compared to the leaders of Eastern and Central Europe, such as Lech Wałęsa. And I think that's important, that the world that was created in 1989 was very significantly shaped by people here. Of course, it was joining Western Europe and the United States, a West that had been shaped in the previous 30 years. But nonetheless, the reuniting of European civilization was a popular and almost a populist movement. So it's not something that was, so to speak, created by intellectuals or imposed by corporations. Secondly, I'd like to say the end of the Cold War increased not only the political liberty of Eastern Europe, but also the economic liberty of people worldwide. There are some people who, and obviously two of them were mentioned today by Mr. Freudenstein, there are people who stress above all else the failure represented by the 2008 financial crisis. They usually misdiagnose that crisis, incidentally, by omitting the crucial role of government and regulation in it. But they miss the far more important point that between 1989 and 2008, between 2 and 3 billion people worldwide were lifted out of grinding poverty and given an opportunity, actually more than given an opportunity, they entered the world labor market. They had an opportunity of greater prosperity, and many of them have entered now the global middle class. That is the biggest revolution, not only of rising expectations, but of rising economic circumstances in human history. And it came about in large part because following 1989, the model which we're calling liberal democracy here was made available to the rest of the world and influenced the decisions of governments worldwide. Now, that's a tremendous historic achievement. And by the way, it does look now, although less in Europe, unfortunately, than in the rest of the world, that the 2008 financial crisis did not end prosperity, did not end the economic advance. It was a pause in it. If we want to compare, particularly for people like Zizek, if we want to compare systems, we have to compare a system that after 70 to 80 years of being implemented without serious opposition in Central and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, it produced an economic wasteland. Whereas within a relatively short time, liberal democracy produced a great improvement in the living circumstances, both in terms of free minds and in terms of economic prosperity across the world. Now, as Mr. Freudenstein said, history never ends. So what the system we're living under is now being challenged by other ideas, by jihadism, by authoritarian regimes such as China and increasingly Russia, and I'm going to argue by a rather more subtle ideology here in the West that itself claims to be more liberal and more democratic than the liberal democracy we have traditionally understood. We might call this post-democracy or post-liberalism, and that brings me to the point that I want to put to Mr. Freudenstein. Liberalism is one thing, democracy is another. Liberal democracy is a third thing. It's not democracy, it's not liberalism, it's some balancing combination of the two. So we have to look at the degree to which that balance may have got out of kilter. Let me look at liberalism first. Well, liberalism is itself several things. It's a protean set of ideas changeable. Its three most common meanings are the broad Western tradition of constitutional liberty. freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. Secondly, classical liberalism or neoliberalism, which is a broad reliance upon free market economics. And I won't be discussing that a lot in the next few minutes, but it's an important element. And then there is a third meaning of liberalism today, which is progressive state intervention, initially in economic policy, more recently in education and in social mores, enforced by a kind of coercion which we call political correctness. Now, I venture to say we are all liberals in the sense of one, the broad constitution of tradition of liberty. Most conservatives are liberals in the sense of classical liberalism in economics. But it is the left parties on both sides of the Atlantic that tend to be liberals under meaning 3, progressive state intervention, etc. Although, of course, parties on the right have drifted considerably in that direction too. Now, the problem is, even if there were just one liberalism, that there is a tension between liberalism and democracy. Democracy is about who exercises power and how they get to exercise it by multi-party elections. Liberalism is about the limits on the exercise of power by government. In principle, the dividing line between these ideas is simple. A constitution establishes rules restraining the government. It can't cancel elections, for example. A constitutional court interprets these rules, sometimes overriding laws or government regulations. Obviously, that's a situation in which clashes will sometimes occur. And they generally occur in 2 circumstances. The first is when an elected government rejects constitutional limits on its authority. The second is when a constitutional court exceeds its own authority by making laws rather than interpreting them. And both sets of clashes are bound to occur more frequently when a third factor comes into it. And that is the increasing tension between liberalism as constitutional liberty and liberalism as progressive state intervention, or what we might call liberal policy. So it's the liberal structure of constitutions versus liberal policies. Now, in the past, traditional liberalism, and in the present among classical liberals, traditional liberalism assumed that people might differ in various ways. The rich versus the poor, religious people versus secular people, enlightened people versus people bound by customs. And they drew up laws intended to minimize the conflicts between them, or when they couldn't minimize them, to arbitrate between them. Has liberal democracy become, in some sense, unbalanced? Is it tipping too far away from democracy and moving and giving too much power to liberal institutions and liberal elites? And if that is the case, as I suspect, what prudently can we do about it? Thank you.
I don't have any instructions how to follow, but I have an idea how to follow. So I give the floor now to the audience. If you have any question or comment.
Bence Bamer from Hír TV. And I have a question for Mr. Freudenstein. What did you make of Mr. Viktor Orbán's speech about illiberal democracy, and what would be your advice to the Prime Minister?
Rastislav Kačer, I'm Slovak ambassador. Both to Roland and John. We see, even in traditional liberal democracies, which were rock solid for decades, not us, 25 years young, maybe more fragile and vulnerable. We see a revival of these anti-systematic movements, something where the old traditional parties, the division left, right, liberal, whatever they are, conservative, are challenged. And we see less and less trust in traditional political structures. And we see the rise of parties which are not parties, but rather clusters of individuals who challenge the system as such. Not even liberal democracy, but, you know, sort of even having no vision, clear vision, what they want. Hungary was a little more immune for that, but maybe that immunity is gone when I look for the past weeks, what's happening on the streets, but definitely Slovakia, Czech Republic, but you know, go to Sweden, the Netherlands, many other countries. How do you read? You know, what is your reading? Why this is happening, and what is the future of these anti-systematic revolt in liberal democracies.
Good evening, I'm Gabor Dobosh. Well, thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure, very interesting debate. I'd like to ask Mr. Freudenstein that he said that we have to call it liberal democracy in order to mark the difference between democracy in which there is no separation of powers. My question is why we have to call it liberal, because in the end, I know it's established language, but in the end it's a principle of organizing the state. So why can't we call it, for example, Christian or conservative or anything else than liberal? Thank you.
Right, well, first I think I should answer to John's question. Has liberal democracy distanced itself from the original? No, because as I said, if liberal democracy is a form of government and the phenomena you described are policies, then we're not talking about the same thing. Indeed, liberal democracy enables socialist economic policies. It enables liberal civic rights policies. It enables a Christian democratic concept of social welfare. It enables subsidiarity as opposed to centralism. Both things are, all these are possible within liberal democracy. So if we talk about liberal democracy as a form of government, there are developments that you describe, like political correctness, that I would also deplore. But I would never blame it on liberal democracy. So that's maybe, there's more of a conceptual difference between us than a difference on content. Now, as to the speech of the Hungarian Prime Minister, I wish I ultimately understood what he was trying to say. I've watched it on YouTube. I've read the transcript. The transcript differs from what he seems to have said according to the subtitling on the YouTube clip. You know, I mean, there are two possibilities. Either there is a fundamental difference between liberal and illiberal democracy. Then I can't say I agree with illiberal democracy as being the hit, the star of the international environment of the future. And then this is what I try to say here. I think that the so-called alternatives in China, in India, in Turkey, in Singapore, in Russia, out of all places, I think these so-called alternatives are by no means superior or have a better future than Western liberal democracy. But if there is no fundamental difference between these two concepts, which is what I'm being told, then I don't know what all the fuss is about. So I'm lost, frankly speaking. What I would like to say is the following. If we assume that liberal democracy continues to exert an attraction, and again, I quoted the examples from Gezi Park to Euromaidan to Hong Kong's Occupy Central, then I think it's pretty obvious that this attraction only works if the proponents of liberal democracy, if the leaders of the West are united, clear, and coherent. If we don't defend liberal democracy from its obvious detractors, from Messieurs Zizek, Dugin, and Lee, then who will defend it? How credible are we in talking back to authoritarian rulers if we start playing around with the concepts of checks and balances ourselves? And who will answer to the aspirations of democrats across the globe if the West doesn't do it in a somehow coherent and clear manner? Now, Rastislav, Mr. Ambassador, your question on anti-system movements and clusters of individuals, that's worth a seminar on its own. The Martin Center 2 years ago published a paper called All Tomorrow's Parties, and it was about the new phenomena in the landscape, in the forms of organization. Actually, the trigger at the time was a thing called the Pirate Party in Germany. it's been a few years since anyone heard of it, really. But 3 years ago, it looked like a scary thing to the established parties. The Pirate Party achieved up to 9, 10, 11% in regional elections. And the Pirate Party was based on concepts like liquid democracy. They were like basically taking their decisions online on the internet. And it was politically on the left, of course, but it was very hard to place in the traditional political spectrum. And it seemed to usher in a new phase in party-based democracy, namely less stability, more chaos, if you want, less calculability, and yet they have disappeared completely. But in the meantime, we have new political parties, especially in the new member states, still new member states after 10 years of the European Union. We've got millionaires becoming politicians now recently. That's definitely a trend. We have more new parties, more creations of parties than we had 10 or 20 years ago. But you know, I think it's too early to make any final verdict on this and to be able to answer the question, what is going to be the effect on freedom? Because that's the real question. I mean, how is it ultimately going to affect freedom? All we can say for the moment that politics has become less calculable, cycles have become much shorter, news cycles are shorter, decision-making cycles are shorter, things change much faster than they used to in the past. This is also largely thanks to social media, of course. And I think these new phenomena and the accelerating life cycle of political movements and parties is another effect of the acceleration of politics through social media. So, you know, at the moment, I think we're more asking questions than giving answers to this. And Gabor Dobos, the question, why liberal democracy, not Christian democracy? I think we have to accept the common usage of these words internationally, where Christian democracy is a political set of political ideas. I try to avoid the word ideology because I think that's reserved to more extreme political ideas. But Wikipedia classifies Christian democracy as a political ideology, whereas it classifies liberal democracy as a form of government. And there we go. That's, I mean, of course we can say that we invent a new political language here. But I think if we live in an international community, we should somehow stick to terms that are in general usage. And if someone tells me that the term liberal democracy is a successful attempt of a liberal conspiracy to usurp a political term, and we have let this happen and we should reverse it, look, I have no problem with political liberalism. My political party, the Christian Democratic Union of Germany, says in its platform, and I quote verbatim, our roots, the roots of the CDU in Germany, are in conservatism, liberalism, and Christian social teachings, in that sequence. So I respect anyone who has a different opinion, but please accept that me as a Christian Democrat, I have no problems in saying that my party also has liberal roots.
Well, I am a liberal and a conservative, so I don't see the necessary contradiction there. But let me just first deal in order with the points raised. And in dealing with Mr. Orban's comments, I'll begin by responding to Roland. I mean, it seems to me that he and I would be on the same side in all the practical political debates and arguments on this. But I would argue it's not quite as clear as he's stating the distinction between liberal structure in a liberal democracy and the policies that liberal parties may advocate. Because the modern theoretical liberal says that somebody who is free from state control does not thereby become free. I mean, this goes right back to Rousseau. Does not become free because he's still the prisoner of customs, religion. He psychologically needs to be liberated from these things. Now, the means of psychological liberation are you are, in effect, re-educated. And I think an old-fashioned liberal like me finds that repellent. But it's an argument about the nature of liberalism. It's not simply a kind of a liberal policy which comes from somewhere else. So when we're looking at liberal democracy, at the concept, I'm in favor of liberalism of the old-fashioned kind and of democracy. I'm nervous of the kind of liberal democracy that has calcified into a kind of ideology and which wants to transform society along the lines that a liberal academic in a good university in Western Europe or United States might feel desirable. So I think there is a real problem for the concept of liberal democracy here, and I would like to rescue liberal democracy from it. But I don't think it's simply that people putting forward liberal policies. And in Mr. Orban's case, I think he's trying to deal with that. I think he chose the wrong term when he was criticizing what he disliked. I think illiberal democracy is not the right diagnosis. I think undemocratic liberalism, which I proposed here, is a better one, and I would sort of stick with that and argue the case. Now, this is a very interesting question about the anti-system movements. You know, it's 60 years since the publication in England of The Rise of the Meritocracy by Michael Young. And and the phrase meritocracy was not meant by him, he had coined it, to be a word of praise or commendation. He was highly skeptical of it. And this was a brilliant political satire which postulated that developments in society, higher education and elsewhere, were going to produce a new cognitive elite, and the cognitive elite was going to be more and more remote from the mass of particularly of working class people, and the working class organizations would lose their natural leaders through the education system, and they would become a kind of leaderless mass. But at the end of the book, which, as I say, is a kind of satire for those who haven't read it, and I recommend it very strongly. He reports, the narrator reports, that something very odd is happening. Everything seems to be going well, but there'll be these riots that keep breaking out, and people feel obviously discontent. I can't see what they've got to worry about, but because they're well looked after. But and good people are running things, and the government cares about them. But nonetheless, they're rebelling, and we don't know how to handle it. Now, I think something like that might be an explanation here. In other words, elites have become progressively remote from the concerns of ordinary people. Working class, I know in America and in Britain, the working class feels itself no longer represented by the organizations that used to represent it, and it's looking around for new political representation. So I'm inclined to think something like that is going on. I don't know it, but that's my guess, and as I say, I recommend the book. Christian democracy. There is a difference between the term Christian democracy or the term socialist democracy than the term liberal democracy. And here Roland and I are, I think, unqualifiedly on the same side. A socialist democracy means that the democracy is bound to run a socialist economic system. In other words, you can't democratically say, I'm sorry, we don't want socialism, we're voting you out and putting someone else in. No. That's something you're not allowed to do. You're within, the democratic decisions are simply prevented from making that decision. Democratic elections are. Christian democracy is slightly different. It's a recommendation for policies based upon, in a sense, benevolent fellow feeling and the moral traditions of the Christian church. And again, some socialists would say that they too drew inspiration from those things, and it becomes a civilized discussion about taxation, welfare, and so on. And this is simply an indication to the voters that your heart is goes in a certain direction. Now, liberal democracy, as we've been discussing, is about a system in which The voters get to make the decisions, but we have to find some way of protecting the rights of people. And go back to the argument of before, but let me just give you an illustration where I think things have become unbalanced. Whether or not you like the idea of same-sex marriage, it is plain that in the United States, it is being imposed on large numbers of people, the majority in states which have voted in referenda against it by the judicial system. And as I say, you may like that outcome, but I do not believe anyone with democratic instincts can approve of the way that that decision has been reached. And that's where I think liberal democracy has become unbalanced. We need to find a way of preventing the courts or other institutions, bureaucracies, international agencies, from imposing what they think are good ideas on the rest of us without going through democratic forms.
Maybe it would be interesting to start a second round of questions and contributions.
Thank you. Frank Spengler from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I'm also a Christian Democrat. And for us in my party, and Roland's party, freedom, liberty is never without binding. And the binding comes with two elements, solidarity and responsibility. That's where we see the limits of the liberal policies, and we have had a lot of discussions in our coalition government with the Liberal Party on abortion and other issues, where we have a different opinion, even though the liberal element is for sure part of our party philosophy. But there are limits, and we are defending them, and we define them. The second, and this is my question. For many years we discussed in the foundation how to reform a country. Shall we start with the economy or shall we start with the political system? And I'm an economist, so I always said, let's start to create a market system and then the political system will follow. So I don't know if the theory today is still relevant. So can a country which has a market-oriented economy in the long run sustain an authoritarian regime? Or will you see some changes in those countries? Or will the economy collapse? Or what is your argument? Because the socialist market economy in China, for example, is that an example where you will see in the future a different economic and a different political system? Or where are we heading to?
I just wanted to read a quote. And it says, one party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks, but when it is led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today, it can also have great advantages. Now, that was not Mr. Lee. That was Thomas L. Friedman in the New York Times. Any comments?
I have a sense, rather, of liberalism evolving. And so what we have now is kind of, from whenever we want to start the date of its beginning. But Mr. Freudenstein, I sense you it's kind of a monolithic entity that hasn't evolved, nor will it continue to evolve. But I sense that Mr. O'Sullivan is much more leaning towards my interpretation of liberalism. So that's one point, is not that it's a static entity. Second point, you admitted, if that's a word we can use here, liberal democracy is not doing too well these days. It has a shaky reputation in some places, and it's not doing as well as it could. That's okay, but why would you expect people around the world who are struggling with democracy to then say, oh, well, liberal democracy is really good, it's doing really good things, when even someone who is really pro-liberal democracy is saying it's rather, I don't want to go that far, it's rather weak. There are decided weaknesses. And even people who are living in liberal democracies, and I'm from Canada, the voter turnout is becoming so embarrassing low that this concept of vote and ability to vote, it's becoming almost irrelevant.
Ágoston Mrász from Danube Institute. Question to Mr. Freudenstein. Is it not easier to call liberal democracy just democracy? Because I think what you described as liberal democracy is in the Hungarian political language just democracy, a form of political government and separation of power, defending liberal values. It is the same as in the Hungarian language, democracy. And could you accept that there are also countries in which words like liberal democracy has a different meaning, or better to say that there are the same phenomenon, the same political things which are called in a different way. I mean, for example, the federalism in Europe. In England, you would say it is a superstate. In Germany, you would say it is federalism. In Eastern Europe, you would say it is a strengthening of cooperation of national states. This is the same phenomenon, but you have in several countries, in several political culture, different definition, different words for it. And I think in Hungary, as I said already, the democracy, the meaning of democracy is the same as you described as liberal democracy. Therefore, my question, is it okay, is it acceptable if in a country liberal democracy is called just democracy?
Right. The first question was, how is China and other emerging economies going to develop? Well, obviously, there are several scenarios. I think one possibility is a slow further evolution, because China has evolved already, even politically. You know, the possibility to somehow utter one's opinion is today better than it was 30 years ago. And yet, it's a system that is amazingly afraid of open discourse. You know, whenever President Obama visits China, there are crackdowns on internet traffic. There are constant attempts by the Chinese Communist Party and the intelligence agencies to control the internet. They're mining the internet to find out what people think, and using it against so-called dissidents. This whole fear of dissidents is an amazing sign of insecurity. You know, I mean, Madame, if you said that, you know, I admitted that the West feels bad about itself. Yeah, the West feels openly bad about itself. Whereas Chinese representatives will tell you that the West has already lost the battle of the systems, but they suppress open discussion at home. For what is that a sign, Madame, if not for a terrific insecurity about the sustainability of their own power system? You know, we're just being open about it. And I think ultimately that's our strength. In the short run, that's our weakness. But in the long run, this is the strength of liberal democracy, is that we can doubt. We can question our own beliefs and our own power structures. But anyway, coming back to the future of China, there are other scenarios. There are many ideas about a much more violent, a much more incalculable development in the future of China, with increasing differences in development between the cities and the countryside, between different parts of the country, social unrest. We already have a high degree of social unrest in China, you know. I mean, the way the Chinese state presents itself to the outside world can be summarized in the word harmony. Harmony is also the key word of the Chinese dream, as Xi Jinping calls the new the manifestation of China's identity to the rest of the world. It's all based on harmony. Well, if you look at what's really going on the ground in China, it's everything but harmony. Chinese political life is not harmonious. There's a tremendous frustration about corruption, about pollution, about infrastructure projects that have gone wrong. And I think all this is proof that there are other possible futures for China than a slow evolution towards liberty. So, you know, the jury is out. We will see. I do think that also in the long run, the increasing exchange of ideas with countries like Taiwan will have an effect on mainland Chinese society. Maybe less the protests in Hong Kong. I mean, that is seen by most mainland Chinese as it's alien territory. You know, they were colonized by the Brits, and therefore they're a different brand. But what's happening in Taiwan, you know, whenever a mainland Chinese goes to visit Taiwan, and it happens hundreds of thousands of times a year now, first thing they do when they're in a hotel room, they switch on the television. And they see what free debate can do, what media freedom and independent media can do for a society. And some of them stay glued to their hotel television for entire days. And they go back to the mainland and they pass on the story. You know, this is going to have an effect on the future of Chinese society. But since we're talking about 1.3 billion people, it's going to take a long time. The final question by Augustin, just calling liberal democracy, well, that reminds me of Václav Klaus, who said that he's for the market economy without adjectives. You know, and that was his answer to the claim of the European People's Party on the social market economy. Well, I do think that these adjectives do matter. And listen, I'm the last person who would prescribe anything to any people in any other country. You know, I'm not accepting. It's not in my remit to accept the usage of a word in some country. What I'm trying to say is that if you do engage in these semantic exercises, be aware of the consequences. And be aware that there is a war of ideas going on between liberal democracy and authoritarian systems. So the question, cui bono, who is helped by what you are saying, is a relevant question. And again, I'm the last person who would tell anybody else what to call this or that. What I'm presenting here is my concept, and I'm trying to make everyone in this room aware of the consequences that it can have. But again, that's my subjective perspective.
Religion is very interesting in all these contexts. The most successful religious society in the world today, this may change, is the United States of America. It's an officially secular society, but religion flourishes there far more than it does, let's say, in modern Germany, in which people actually pay tax subsidies to the church. Christian religion is not dead in England, but it is moribund, despite the fact that England is officially an Anglican state. The Queen of England is the head of the Church of England. Of course, that has almost no relationship to the laws that are passed, or today to the moral principles that govern the society, but it is the case. Most of us, I think, if we were Machiavelli advising some prince, would say, look, let religions develop on their own, let them give them as much freedom as you can, and unless they are preaching direct subversion or oppressing seriously some members of society, for example women, then just let them be. And they will be a support to the regime. In China today, the regime is hostile to religion and is nervous when it tries to control religion, and is nervous when uncontrolled religion makes an appearance. As a result, Christianity is making enormous strides in terms of increasing numbers of people becoming Christians, And the regime is making them enemies, quite needlessly, because most, not all, but most Christian denominations preach that legitimate authority has to be respected. So the next point I would make is this. You can only predict the future in retrospect. I can always tell you exactly why something happened once it's happened. But I'm not able to tell you what is going to happen, and if I do so successfully, it's a lucky strike and not a result of my genius. Now, so the things you're saying, the things that we were discussing here, yes, they're all sensible, I think. Nobody said anything silly, but at the same time, we just don't know what's going to happen in China any more than we can predict what's going to happen in India, which is a very different society on different foundations. And we have been wrong in every time we've thought there was a new world-conquering system coming about. The last one, I think, was Japan. And we decided Japan was the wave of the future at exactly the moment when Japan stumbled into deflation and 2 decades of depression, so of recession. So we don't know these things. I am fascinated by your remarks about, as a German Christian Democrat, you would say there have to be limits on freedom. I mean, I obviously, in this common sense way, we would all accept that in a general way. But what are you thinking of?
Now it's working. Now you see when Prime Minister in Turkey, Erdogan, said we are a Christian club. I said, no, we're not a Christian club. But we have Christians who are governing countries. So it's a form of government. And we are limited by this, our belief. So we have a compass. We know how to decide in certain questions where liberals may have, I don't know, an open debate. But for us, abortion it's not an issue of liberalism. It's a belief, and we have to follow that.
Well, it's more than that,
actually.
That's
one example.
No, but abortion is a good example because, I mean, I'll probably share your views on it. I'm for restrictions on abortion, very severe ones. But that's because, that's the reason for that, in my view, is because you're protecting the rights of the unborn child. I mean, there's a clash. When the rights of two people clash in liberal theory, there has to be an arbitrator who will protect both rights and adjudicate between them. The current liberal position seems to be, in my view mistakenly, that the fetus has no rights at all and is entirely the decision of the mother. Now, I think that's wrong, but I think it's wrong on liberal grounds as well as on religious grounds or whatever. So I suspect that you're more freedom-minded than you allow yourself to think, and I certainly believe that liberalism in the old-fashioned sense of respecting other people's opinions and allowing them to say what they think is the dominant view among ordinary people. Sorry.
Which is not debated here. This is injustice. The social market economy was not developed because we had too much liberal free market economy. But we knew the limits of free market economy, and we have decided on continental Europe to introduce what we call the social market economy, the responsibility of capital, and so on and so on. There is a difference. And the social Christian teaching was the basis of that model, so there are differences. And that's where we always have our debates. A system which is liberal and doesn't deliver the goods the people want, I mean freedom of poverty, for example, not freedom for exploitation. And that's a different approach.
The social market economy is delivering for the people of Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece at the moment. And I think justice, insofar as social justice applies to economic questions, would be a judgment of a very adverse kind on the euro. And yet the Christian Democrats are, for what they doubtless think good reasons, are the strongest supporters of continuing the euro in its present sense. So, and secondly, my feeling is that if you are looking for justice in economic questions, I don't think that there is huge differences between the liberal market economy of the United States, to a lesser extent of Britain and Germany. All of them suffer. I mean, Germany's a prosperous country. It's doing very well. And therefore it's able to pay more. But if you look at the condition of the poor in America versus the rest of the world, and I think there are lots of things wrong, by the way, with the system in America as it affects poor people, but they actually have a higher income because the economy has been more successful than the poor in other countries.
On income, by the way, do you know there are 4 global lists of per capita GDP from 1 to 170 or whatever the number of countries is. It's World Bank, IMF, and a couple of other organizations, I think United Nations and so on. Did you know that Russia is 20 places above China still? Russia is in the early 50s and China is in the late 70s. It's amazing. We tend to think, Americans, the majority of American citizens believe China today has a higher per capita GDP than the United States. It's not true. And it will take a long time for them to reach that level. So yes, I mean, China has made a fantastic development in the last 30 years. But it's far away from achieving even the level of prosperity that Russia has today. I think sometimes it's worth it to keep things, in proportion. And I would like to just come back to one thing I forgot to mention about the turnout in elections in Western societies. Indeed, I do think that some of us have become complacent. And as Reagan once said, freedom has to be one. Is it called? Unfreedom is only one generation away, whatever point in time we talk about. The lack of freedom is only one generation away, and we have to earn our freedom constantly. Becoming complacent is a bad thing, but it happens in societies that usually have been free for some time. Whereas, if I may again quote the Euromaidan as an example, there were people risking and actually losing their lives for the rule of law, living in a society where corruption is limited, where you can say your opinion, where courts are independent, and where the people can decide about the political system and the foreign alliances of their country. There were some people who, during the European election campaign this year, and the presidential election campaign in Ukraine, said there are more European flags in Ukrainian cities than in Paris, Brussels, and Berlin. And there was something to it. So, whenever we lose faith or find that our formal our structures of our democracy is questionable, I think we would do a good job by looking outside of these countries and looking at countries where people actually risk their lives to achieve what we have. There's a famous YouTube clip of the early days of the Hong Kong Occupy Central protests, where a female student speaks right into the camera and she says, "You have democracy, we don't. Help us." I couldn't put it more simply than that. And in that perspective, I find sometimes it's a bit of a luxury to complain about this or that negative effect or disadvantage that our liberal democracy may produce temporarily for one group or the other group.
I've had many conversations with my husband through the years about who should vote, because I think there should be some qualifications. With rights come responsibilities. And if people know nothing about the government, should they really be voting? it's a very difficult decision to make some standards. My husband grew up in a society in which not everyone had the right to a secret ballot. Many people had to vote in open, and therefore they were not really free to express their real opinions. And so he feels more strongly than I do that everyone should have a right to vote. But yet I think there should be some standards, because when you vote in ignorance, you are canceling out the vote of people who have studied the situation and know what they're doing. So this is for both.
Well, I'm 100% on your husband's side, I'm afraid. And for this reason, two reasons, I suppose. One is, well, let's look at the casting a vote. On the one hand, you have an unlettered peasant who works 6 days a week, is aware of the realities of labor and life, and if he votes, he really doesn't know about the technicalities of tax policy, and therefore he's cancelling out the vote of an enlightened, intelligent, qualified person like, for example, Barack Obama, the law professor from a very good American university. Do we really think that members of the cognitive elite, people who live all their lives in kind of a cognitive elite bubble, who marry people like themselves, and who manipulate symbols and words very often as a means of living, do we really think that they are more aware of the realities of life than people who work with their hands, who labor, who don't have a high income, who have to make their income stretch to cover the good things of life, who if they have a child, they have to spend less money on themselves because they want to give that child a good upbringing? I just simply don't believe that members of elites or just averagely well-informed people are, so to speak, better than in casting a vote than people who are close to the hard realities of life. And secondly, it is, after all, a lot of people don't vote. The people you're worried about very often don't vote, except when they feel genuinely oppressed. And as James Burnham, the great American strategic writer, pointed out in his book, The Machiavellians, the real advantage of democracy is that, the reality of it is it's a competition between elites for the favor of the people. Now, the elites are going to have different sets of policies, but they'll be roughly coherent. Each will be roughly coherent. But they have to convince the people that their policies are going to make their lives better, or at least not worse. And the pressure on elites to concern themselves with genuine public welfare is obviously going to be greater when all classes can vote. So I'm totally on Janosch's side here, and I'm not particularly worried about people not voting either, as the Canadian lady was suggesting, for this reason, that people not voting is generally because they don't care. If it mattered, if they really were being oppressed, they would care and they would go out and vote. And voting tends to rise during crises and periods of great difficulty. It tends to stabilize at around 65, 70% when things are okay.